I would now like to welcome Dr. Anna Scott. Anna is an assistant professor and senior research fellow at the Institute for Evidence-Based Healthcare at Bond University. Anna is an epidemiologist and a systematic reviewer, and her primary research interests are the development of innovative processes and automation tools to make systematic reviews and evidence syntheses in general more rapid. This includes the 2-week systematic review initiative, and if you haven't already, I encourage everyone to check out at 2week SR on Twitter, where all of Anna's work has been showcased. So without further ado, I welcome Dr. Anna Scott.
If you do systematic reviews, you're an excellent and very big company. So this is a figure I obtained from PubMed. I was curious. So we all saw the paper by Hilda Bastian and Paul Baggio and Ian Chalmers about 10 years ago about how we're up to something like 75 trials and 10 systematic reviews a day. And I was curious how things have changed since then. So I went to PubMed, punched in a systematic review and title and abstract on the assumption that people are more or less Prisma compliant, at least for the last 10 years, selected publications that are only reviews, and this is what it looks like. So we went from fewer than one systematic review a day published in 2000, so about 22 years ago, to about 10 a day, about 11 years ago, and now we're up to about 100 a day. In and of itself, this wouldn't be a problem, right? Except all of these systematic reviews take a whole lot of time and a whole lot of resources to produce. So this is a print screen from a project that a group of Americans did back in 2017, so about 5 years ago now. And they were curious to see just how much time and resources it takes to prepare a systematic review. So they took a sample of just under 200 registered protocols from Prospero, which is the registry where you register your systematic review protocols. And they worked out that a median for a systematic review takes a median of 5 people to do. And from the time that project is registered, so when the protocol is registered on Prospero to publication, it takes a median of 66 weeks. So that's around 15 months. Now, of course, a lot varies by journal, right? Some journals are pretty quick with peer review, some a little bit slower. Things are even worse now with COVID, right? A lot of editors are saying it's very difficult to get peer reviewers to do peer reviews. So to account for that, we wrote to the authors to see if they had data that excludes that time in journal review. And they said that number is 41 weeks. So 9.5 months from the time when the protocol is registered on Prospero to when the systematic review is completed and submitted to a journal. That is long enough to make a whole new human. That's much too long. So that's what we're trying to fix. And I'll tell you a bit of a backstory about how this crazy idea of doing systematic reviews in 2 weeks came about. And the guilty party is pictured over there. That's Paul Baggio, who is my boss here at the Institute and whom I have worked with for about 6 years now. So when I first rocked up to the Institute back in 2016, I saw and I heard Paul present this slide a few times. And he usually says something like, computing power is getting cheaper and it's getting much faster, gene sequencing getting cheaper and faster, why not systematic reviews? Why aren't we doing systematic reviews in 2 weeks yet? Now, one of my flaws is that I tend to be very literal. So one day, back in October 2018, he said that once too many. And I said, look, let's see if we can actually do this. Let's see if we can do a systematic review in 2 weeks. And that's how this idea was born. Oops, sorry. So the first 2-week SR, what was it that we were actually trying to do? Well, the idea was to do a proof of concept, right? So what we were trying to do is to do a full systematic review. And I use that term deliberately to differentiate from so-called rapid reviews, right? So the rapid reviews are like systematic reviews, except there's usually some kind of a methodological shortcut. So for example, instead of having 2 people screen in parallel, perhaps one person screens everything and a second person screens only 20% as a check. or maybe fewer databases are searched, or perhaps the risk of bias assessment isn't conducted, right? So there's all these shortcuts. And the reason why people have historically shifted to rapid reviews is because, as we saw, a full systematic review takes a heap of time. And, you know, if a clinician comes to you, or if you are a clinician or a decision maker, you don't always have 15 months or 9 months to come back to them with an answer. And we saw a lot of that, especially now during COVID. So that's, strictly speaking, this timeline is from prior to COVID, but that's the issue we were trying to fix. So we're trying to do a full systematic review, just like we have done many times before, just do it in a very compressed timeline. And as part of that project, we were measuring how long every single step took. So literally person minutes, there are spreadsheets galore. Of course, we added everything up to see how long the whole systematic review took. And we also kept track of the barriers and facilitators to see, A, whether we can actually pull this off, and if we can, what helped and what hindered. So this was us on day one. Day one was Monday, the 21st of January, 2019. And because we're academics, not clinicians, we started at 9:30. And that's my colleague, Justin Clark, and myself. Pictures are more or less accurate. When the panic set in about what it was exactly we were trying to do. Not pictured here are the other two team members. So Paul Blagier, whom you saw earlier, and also Crystal Marr, who was also part of that team. So this is what that systematic review looked like. That's the characteristics of it. So one of the main work streams in our institute is antimicrobial resistance. So a lot of the work we do is looking at alternatives to antibiotics for conditions where they are often prescribed. So for this specific review, we were interested in the impact of increased fluid intake on urinary tract infections. Cross intervention questions. So we only included RCTs, screened just under 1,400 title abstracts after deduplication, included 8 studies. We were able to do a few meta-analyses. As I said, there are 4 people on it. All 4 of us are very experienced systematic reviewers, and it took us 2 weeks. So the first week we worked Monday to Friday, didn't check the calendar. It turned out that Monday was a day off for Australia Day in the second week, so we didn't work that. And then we started on Tuesday and worked till Friday at noon. And if you're interested in reading both the review and the methods paper, which talks about how we did it, what automation tools we used, and what the barriers and facilitators were, the references are on the bottom, but I'm absolutely happy to share the slides, so no need to write anything down. That was us at the end. So if you don't follow the running world, this is Eliud Kipchoge when he finished, when he broke the 2-hour barrier for marathon. We weren't quite that fast, but I'm sure we were just as happy as he was. So this is the details of what we did in between the start and the last day. So in the second leftmost column are the list of all the systematic review tasks, which we've all seen before. So you start with the review question, of course, and the protocol, design and execution of the search strategy, screening, data extracting, risk of bias, meta-analyses, and so on. What surprised us was that the total time it took to go from the very start to when we had a full completed systematic review manuscript was 61 person-hours. That blew even our minds, because what we had expected, sorry, my light's gone off. What we had expected is that between 4 people working 2 weeks, roughly full-time on this, it would have been about 300. This is about 1/5 of that. We kept track of time it took to format the manuscript for the journal. Of course, some journals take longer than others. Added another 5 hours, and the total time to get the changes made after the manuscript came back from the journal was a total of 71 hours. So that was it, 71 person-hours to go from the disclosure, to go from the first meeting when we decided the PICO until the finalized product, 71 hours. if you think we stacked the deck to get it done, you are absolutely correct. And I will be the first to admit that. It was a proof of concept, so we set up the conditions to be as favorable as possible. So we had a team that was very experienced systematic reviewers who had a mix of complementary skills. So Paul and Chris, very experienced clinician researchers, but also very accomplished methodologists. Justin is a Cochrane senior search specialist. He's very good at searching. And I'm an epidemiologist and a systematic review methodologist. And all four of us have jointly and apart from each other published and completed multiple systematic reviews prior to this. We had protected time, and as I found out later, Paul and Chris asked our colleagues to basically leave us alone while we're doing this. It turned out it wasn't necessary because, as I said, we didn't actually require the 2 full-time weeks to work on this, but the intent was to quarantine us off from other projects to focus on just this for 2 weeks. We also have daily meetings. So this is something we never used to do as part of our systematic reviews. We had adopted this starting from that systematic review because what it enabled us to do is to sort of keep the momentum going, but also it was an opportunity for the whole team to come together each day and say, here's the things I finished yesterday, here's the things I'm going to do today, here's the barriers I came across, do you have any ideas for how to fix this? And here's the things that I found helped me. I'm sharing because it might help you as well. This isn't to say we didn't communicate outside of that, because we did constantly. But those meetings were sort of a way to take stock at the beginning of every day. And we use systematic review automation tools for pretty much everything we could. So here at the Institute, we run something called the Systematic Review Accelerator, which is an initiative to develop systematic review automation tools. So a lot of the tools that we use were developed in-house, which is to say, A, we knew that they existed, and B, we also knew how to use them. So there was no learning curve, which would have added extra time to the time to completion, of course. So here's the actual tools that we used. And a lot of these tools, some of these tools we have since replaced, and some of these tools we have since abandoned, and we have since developed new ones. But that was what we had to work with at the time. So word frequency analyzer is something we use to generate our search strategy. So before we start a review, as I'm sure many of you do, we ask the clinicians who are experts on the topic to provide several articles to use as a validation set. So the validation set articles are the ones that would have probably been included at the title abstract screen stage of the systematic review, right? So they would have met your PICO and probably been included in the full systematic review. So we use those to generate the words and phrases to build our search strategy with. Once we have the search strategy, we use something called the search refiner to visualize that search strategy. So that is to see which terms in a strategy contribute to the strategy and which terms don't. And what I mean by that is which terms actually contribute to picking out those validation set articles and which ones do not. Polyglot search translator. So once we have the agreed upon search strategy, this is usually in PubMed, we use the polyglot to translate it automatically from the PubMed syntax into other databases syntaxes. So Embase, Sinol, PsycInfo, and so forth. And it's literally just a push of a button, which is amazing because there's evidence that shows that median time for librarians to do this by hand takes about 3 to 5 hours. So more time savings. Deduplicator, of course, you don't want to screen duplicate records if you don't have to, because again, that takes time that you don't need to spend. SRA Helper used to be a plugin that we used for EndNote to enable hotkeys. So instead of drag and drop, you just press a hotkey. We've since replaced it with Screenatron, which is similar to other systematic review automation tools like JBI Summary or Rayan or Covidence, which allow you to both mark, they include exclude terms, so highlight them in red or green or whatever you want, as well as hotkey things to assign references to groups to, again, speed up the screening part of the systematic review process. If you're lucky enough to be only including RCTs in your systematic review, you can put your search results through robot search. And what it does, it will identify things that are not RCTs in your search library and remove them. Right? Again, decrease your screening load, which saves you time. And note, some people love it, some people hate it, some of us still use it, some of us have switched to other things, as I said, Screenatron, Summary, Confidence Ray, and Distiller, and so on. Sarah is something specific to our university. It's basically a tool for sending multiple full text delivery requests to the library instead of having to type in the form one reference at a time. Robot Reviewer, love it. Again, if you are assessing the risk of bias on RCTs, you can put it through Robot Reviewer and it'll assess the risk of bias on 4 of the 7 domains for you. And Revman Replicant is a nifty little tool that allows you to upload the Revman file and it'll write up the text corresponding to the forest plots for you. So that's what we had at the time. Now that situation has since changed, but I'm getting ahead of myself. So the question was whether that was just a one-off and just how different those conditions were from a standard systematic review. And I will admit, they're quite different. So that first 2-week SR, very tiny team and very experienced one, that's not always the case. Teams vary in size, they vary in experience levels, and they're not always familiar with the automation tools. The first systematic review, again, and our RCT is only intervention question, but of course, systematic reviews ask all sorts of questions, right? Prevalence, prognosis, screening, diagnostic, etc. And what comes with that, of course, different types of study designs are included in the actual review. And of course, things are trickier now with COVID. So in Queensland, we've been actually very lucky. We've been able to work mostly face-to-face for the vast majority of the pandemic, but I know that's not been the case in other states and of course overseas. So things like, not working face-to-face, but rather having to rely on Zoom. And of course, the issues with time zones complicate things. And finally, the protected time. The protected time is a bit controversial because it's very difficult to achieve in practice in academia. We're sort of not used to doing things this way. We're used to balancing 17 projects at a time. It's even more impossible in clinical practice, but I'll come back to that. So was it a fluke? Well, we wanted to find out. So we put the method through its paces. So different types of review questions, different types of included studies, larger screening workloads, and teams with mixed levels of experience. So this is data on the first 10 systematic reviews we did using that method. And as you can see, the topics ranged. So as I said, that first one was increased fluid for urinary tract infections. Then we looked at the impact of self-management interventions for lower urinary tract symptoms and the impact of copper plating on surfaces on hospital-acquired infections. You can see exactly where the pandemic hit. We looked at a few questions about prevalence of COVID and the impact on the adverse events and harms associated with the wear of face masks and how to mitigate those. And then a few other questions about the impact of various bed positions on gastroesophageal reflux disease, HIMPREX for UTIs, the impact of COVID on healthcare utilization, and differences in the levels of antibiotic prescribing when the clinical consultation is via telehealth versus face-to-face. Different types of questions. So most of them are intervention. There are a few prevalence and one utilization question. We did a sort of unofficial test of a prognostic question, but we still need to formally test it on this process. And diagnostic and screening, we haven't done any of those reviews in the recent past. So the next ones that are coming up will definitely be trying using this method. Mix of included study types. So again, randomized trials, then we sort of inch towards a mix of randomized and non-randomized trials. and then took the deep plunge and included systematic reviews with observational studies, or a mix of randomized trials and observational studies. So with those several prevalence questions, of course, these would be cross-sectional studies, and with the utilization question, we looked at before and afters and interrupted time series in that systematic review. Screening workloads. Now, I will admit we have an absolutely fantastic search specialist who gets us very tight search results. So the smallest one was just under 460 title abstracts to screen, so pretty small. The largest one was just under 5,500, so quite sizable. Included studies ranging from 5 to 81. And the data presented in that study by Bora and colleagues that I mentioned earlier that looked at the amount of work it takes to put together a systematic review, they found that a median-sized systematic review includes 15 studies. So the largest one is about 5 times bigger, and the smaller one is about a third of that. Team sizes ranging from 4 to 14. Again, that one with the 81 included studies, we included a fairly sizable team on that one because, of course, a lot of work goes into data extracting 81 studies. But we also prioritized including a larger team here in the service of upskilling team members. Median size tends to be around 6, which is, again, just slightly bigger than the finding by Bora and colleagues of 5 people on a typical systematic review. And experience level, again, the first one, we only wanted to include very experienced reviewers just to see if it's even possible in the first place, but have since prioritized including systematic reviewers who both have some experience and no experience at all to sort of, if you wish, indoctrinate them into the method. When I say some previous experience, I mean something like might have done a couple previous systematic reviews, but never actually led one as a first author. And none is, of course, never done one, so trial by fire. And timelines, anywhere from 5 to 18, which is, from 1 week systematic review to about 4 weeks. Which again is pretty large time savings over the sort of timelines that we are accustomed to when we talk about systematic reviews. So what helped? Again, we retained the emphasis on complementary skills, and I emphasize this because I used to always think this is a given, but it's actually not always the case. I happen to be very lucky to be in an institute where we do have access to all these skills, but not everybody does. But it does help a lot if you have a very good search specialist on your team, if you have experienced methodologists on your team, and clinicians, of course. But having, excuse me, a team with mixed levels of experience is absolutely okay, and the method seems to handle this. The way we manage having people with no experience or less experience on our teams is we always pair them up with somebody who is experienced. And we often decrease their workload a little bit. So let's say you have 2 pairs of screeners on your systematic review. We ask the pair that is inexperienced person paired with an experienced person to do less screening. So for example, they'll do 30%, whereas the experienced pair will do 70%. Protected time. It's primarily important for the screeners, data extractors, risks of bias people to have protected time, although not quite as crucial as we had thought. So some modifications we had made to this to sort of take into account the academic reality and clinical reality is to, for example, have people focus on doing the screening, etc. Let's say all mornings during the week, or just 3 days during the week and leave the other 2 days to do other stuff. The protected time is not really that crucial for clinicians, although it depends on the role. If they are sort of serving in an advisory role as a content expert, obviously it's not required, but it's helpful if they do show up to the daily meetings to sort of be abreast of the progress of things as they're going on, and also to be able to answer questions. Daily meetings. I hate meetings. I avoid meetings. but I find these ones actually really help. So these are the ones I do attend. They help to keep the momentum going. They help to sort of have the big picture of what's progressing and to be able to sort of identify challenges before they become a problem. So if somebody extra needs to help with screening or risk of bias or what have you, people can be reallocated. So all those issues can be addressed before they become a problem. And again, systematic review automation tools. We both use those existing tools that I had mentioned. And most of those, sorry, I forgot to mention, most of those were our tools, but not all of them. So credit where credit is due. Robot Reviewer is not our tool, just to make that clear. And there's also new tools that we have developed since that time. So if you will indulge me, just a small plug for the Systematic Review Accelerator. So these are the tools that we develop here. They're all free and they have help guides, and many of them have also videos, and all of them have instructions. So if you're wanting to use some of them, you're absolutely more than welcome to. And we'd love to hear any sort of feedback, or something is glitching or not working the way it should. Absolutely, please let us know. This is one tool that we have developed since that first 2-week systematic review. So the way we did protocol in that first 2-week systematic review is basically I had a paper template, a document template that I used to use, and it had all the standard heading of a systematic review, method section, and the boilerplate text, because a lot of it really is boilerplate, right? So we had, 2 people screening in parallel independently. Any disputes were resolved by a third author or by consensus. A lot of this text is very repetitive, and it's very standard in systematic review method section. So I had a chat with one of my colleagues who's a genius computer programmer, and he jigged up this tool. It's called the Methods Wizard. And I'm going to actually show you how it works, but super briefly. So the way it works is you set up a new project. And when you do, it gives you a link that you can share with your colleagues. And you can work on this in real time, kind of like with Google Docs. So you set up the title page, who the people are. You can add more people if you like. You can subtract people, etc. And it steps you through all the sections of the methods section of the systematic review protocol, or the full systematic review. So it asks you on the first page to identify your PICO, and you can add inclusions and exclusions. Right, all this text is already pre-written because I wasn't going to put you through my typing this up as we go along. So all the sections of the PICO, and then I'll ask you what study types you wish to use, and you can add whatever you want or subtract. And as you're making the changes to the text or to your choices, it's typing up the automated text on the bottom, right, to correspond to whatever choices you made. So for example, the studies that I picked, randomized trials, crossover case controls. And then you work your way through. So for example, the search strategy, it'll ask you what you're using to generate your search strategy. Are you using synonyms, mesh, etc.? And anything else you want to add, you can always add. So that who designed the search strategy? Did they get help? Was it peer reviewed, etc.? And all those options you type in, again, it automatically spits out the text for you. And in many cases, although not all of them yet, you can rewrite the text if you don't like it. So once you work your way through the whole thing, so I'll skip over to study screening. And again, it's asking, because it asks you on the front page who the authors are here, it automatically pulls up that name so you can say who's doing the screening, in title, abstracts, full text, how you're resolving your disagreements, which automation tools you used. Again, Prism asks for that, so you do have to report it. And then you work your way similarly through data extraction, risk of bias assessment. It gives you a lot of options for what you used to do your risk of bias. And always you can add others, and then data analysis. I'm not going through this in any detail. I apologize, I don't have enough time, but there is a separate presentation online working its way through every single step of these. And then at the very end, once you're finished, you can generate your output, and here's your methods section of your systematic review. So here's your PICO searches, screening, risk of bias and data analysis, and appendices with the search strategy. So that's how Methods Wizard works. So that was how we use the method in in academic reality. But of course, the clinical reality, and I'm guessing a lot of you are clinicians, is a bit different. The idea of setting off a few weeks to do one project is just not going to happen. So what we wanted to see is if we can adapt the 2-week systematic review process to reviews that are led by a clinician. So what we're trying to do is work out a way to make it so that a clinician can complete something like this with about an 80-hour total time commitment across 2 to 3 months, so extended timeline, and get a first author publication, right? So this can be used for something like, for example, fulfilling the requirement from the professional colleges of your research component of your training. So how do we tweak it? So again, getting a team of complementary skills is doable in academia. Protected time is doable but tricky. Daily meetings are doable. And systematic review automation tools are absolutely doable. With clinicians, this gets a little bit tougher. So a team with complementary skills might be a bit more difficult to strike if you're sticking solely to fellow clinicians. Might have to reach out to your academic friends. Protected time, not at all doable. It doesn't really matter that much if the clinician is serving in an advisory content expert role, right? They don't need to be doing the screening, data extracting, etc. They don't need protected time. It's absolutely not at all doable if the clinician is leading. It's just difficult for clinicians to quarantine themselves off for a couple of weeks to work on a single project and leave behind the clinical commitments. Daily meetings, again, if they're in an advisory role, we can just be flexible around when we schedule the meetings. So instead of having them in the mornings, we schedule them whenever they need to happen, and clinician may not always be able to make them, that's fine. And automation tools, we find clinicians are usually aware that automation tools exist, but not necessarily skilled in using them or familiar with how to use them. So the same upskilling as we do with, for example, research assistants or early postdocs, pair them up with somebody who's an experienced user and mentor them through. So these are the modifications we make. Team with complementary skills, standard. Protected time, not an issue if the clinician is an advisory, but if they are a lead author, we extend the timelines to about 2 to 3 months, and the daily meetings become weekly meetings because, again, if they're in a clinical practice, they're busy attending to patients. And automation tools, as I said, we train them on how to use that. That doesn't work. So we've done a sort of a preliminary pre-test of this. We looked at the impact of antibiotics on clinical response in cellulitis. This was a project done, the underlined folks here are the clinicians, and the first lead clinician, Krish, is a clinician from Canada, so added challenge. Charlotte and Gerben are local to us, and the rest of the team is academics from our institute. So we found that it took about 16 weeks to complete. That review is now published. So basically, roughly the timelines that are sort of expected with a rapid review, but it's a full systematic review with meta-analyses. We're currently trying to compress that a little bit. So again, a team that's about half and half clinician academic. We're aiming to get this done in 2 months, and it's currently in progress. So we'll see if we can do that. And I think that 2-month timeline is probably about what we're going to be aiming for, 2 to 3 months, just because, again, clinical reality and commitments. And what we're going to do next is we are actually going to formally test this. So the way we did the first 2 weeks are in the sense of measuring times, various facilitators, and so forth. And we're currently writing up the grant to do exactly that. So scoping reviews. We're not only interested in using this methods for systematic reviews. We actually want to use this method for everything. Overviews of reviews, network meta-analyses, scoping reviews. But one step at a time. Does it work for extending it to scoping reviews? The answer is yes. So a few months ago, a lady I met at a conference sometime last year reached out to me and said, I'm interested in doing a review on a topic. What do you think? So we had a nice chat, and we came to the conclusion that it's not an appropriate topic for a systematic review, but it is an appropriate topic for a scoping review. And I pitched to her the idea of trying to use a 2-week systematic review method to get it done. So these are print screens from her. The day one was the 23rd of May, and the last day was the 9th of June. So it was 14 work days, so 2 full weeks and 4 days of the 3rd week, or 18 calendar days. So she had reached out to me. We had a couple meetings to decide if this was a good idea, who would need to be on the team, and how we would do this. And that was in April and May. As I said, we started on the 23rd May, finished on the 9th of June. So when I say finish, our endpoint is usually a completed manuscript that's ready for external feedback. So one of the things we do at the Institute is we usually circulate our manuscripts to others to get feedback before we submit it to peer review. And as I said, that took 14 work days or 18 calendar days. Uploaded a preprint to Open Science Framework. It's good practice. And manuscript went to a journal on the 13th of June. And just the other day, we got word that the manuscript was accepted for publication. So really, really quick turnaround from the journal, which was fantastic. So credit to the editors and the peer reviewers. So 13 weeks from the day we started working on the scoping review to publication date. If you're wondering what the topic was, because that's kind of an important question, is we were interested in working out what the existing evidence is, the volume and the type on the current use and extent of consumer co-design in nutrition interventions, right? So we brought it beyond the sort of the typical, does drug X work for condition Y, to a much more challenging question in the sense of the type of evidence we were looking at. The team consisted of dietitians and nutritionists, unsurprisingly, there were 5 of them, and mixed levels of prior experience from none to previous systematic reviews and scoping reviews completed and led. 2 methodologists, so myself and Pavel Zelnov, who's our colleague from Moldova or Georgia, one of the 2. And we had a consumer expert join us on this, which was a fantastic experience. We really appreciated having her and her insight, and she got so involved in this. We actually, if you're interested, we wrote a blog describing that partnership as part of the World Evidence-Based Healthcare Initiative. And the methods, of course, JBI methods for scoping reviews, but we added on the 2-week systematic review tweaks. So again, the team complementary skills, but mixed levels of experience. So we paired folks up, experienced with inexperienced. We sort of moved back to the kind of more or less academic approach of mostly protected time for the people who are doing screening and data extracting. We did have daily meetings. One new thing that we did for this one is because we were spread across multiple places in Queensland and Moldova, or Georgia, is we had a dedicated Slack with multiple channels for this project, and we found that actually worked marvelously because people were very good about asking questions and answering questions as issues were coming up, so everybody was sort of on the same page at the same time. And we use automation tools, all the other ones as previous, although of course there are some adjustments. For example, Methods Wizard is set up for protocols for systematic reviews. And of course, there are some differences in the structure of the method section. And of course, the results section of the scoping review. So we took the Methods Wizard output, but we of course had to tweak it a fair bit. So all fine and good, Anna, but how do I do this for myself? Well, I'm not going to stand over you when you do your next review and request that you do this in 2 weeks, because that's crazy. But there are things that you can do to speed up your own systematic and scoping reviews and other reviews that you may happen to do. So team with complementary skills, of course, crucially important. You don't need to have only experienced folks, totally okay to have inexperienced folks. In fact, it's a wonderful opportunity to upskill and build capacity, which is important. but it helps if you pair the folks who are less experienced with the folks who have a lot more experience. Protected time, again, not as crucial as we had thought, which was a surprise. Try to sort of get the screeners, data extractors, risk of bias folks to be working on it consistently. Part of the reasons we prioritize that is because it helps if you're sort of in the zone, because if you do screening, let's say this week, and you do dispute resolution next week, you will have already forgotten why that you made some of the decisions that you had made about exclusions and inclusions. So this sort of tends to minimize the mental reload if you're working on this back to back. And of course, if it's a clinician-led systematic reviews, the timelines will extend. But it seems to us that the timelines are still much faster than the sort of the 9.5. So we're pretty happy with that. Daily meetings, important to keep the momentum going. Communication is of course crucial, and things like Slack channels and other and Teams and other platforms for regular communications are absolutely very helpful. And again, timelines may need to be adjusted if it's a clinician-led project. I'm going to say something a little controversial here. It probably doesn't matter which automation tools you use. It just matters that you use them, because they do help, they do speed things up. So if you're not familiar with it, there is an initiative called the SR Toolbox, Systematic Review Toolbox, which of course there's a Twitter account with that name. But it's basically a database of all the systematic review tools that people report to them. And you can search the database by whether the tool is free or paid and what stage of the review it's applicable for. So I absolutely encourage everybody to use it, and use it liberally. It's a fantastic resource. And again, pairing folks who are experienced with automation tools with inexperience as a way of building capacity and also making the process a little less challenging for them. So I'm going to stop here. This is my contact information at Bond University, and as Tim had kindly mentioned, I do spend a lot of my time on Twitter, probably too much. The systematic review automation tools that we have are at that website, and I'm very happy to answer any questions or hear any suggestions for further developments or ideas. So, thank you.